to what they then called the magnetic state, because it was animal magnetism, at a distance. And apparently, from published accounts, it was widely acknowledged amongst all the magnetizers who took up this art that people can be influenced by the thought at a distance. It was common knowledge then. But then we have to move right up to the 19th century to find Myers, who decided to investigate it scientifically. And he did his research with Pierre Janet and William James, with a subject called Leonie, Madame B. And this is what astonishes me. It's the most important subject in the history of psychology. And it's ignored. So my question is, why is that? Why has it taken someone like me to dig around and go through the archives of the society and uncover this, and then find that since Myers, Leonid Vasiliev, 1891-1966, Russian neurologist, had heard about the work of Myers and Janet, and he was a neurologist at the Department of Brain Research at the University of Leningrad in the 1920s and 30s. And under the auspices of the London Society, this society, in the 1920s, experiments were conducted to test the hypothesis that a person can be hypnotised from London to Australia. The Greek Society for Psychical Research conducted experiments. Athens to Paris, distance of 2,101 kilometres. Warsaw to Athens, 1,597 kilometres. Vienna to Athens. Leningrad to Sevastopol, 1,700 kilometres. And the experiments were simple. The agent at one end, the agent in Sevastopol, would issue hypnotic suggestions to the subject. The agent in Leningrad would issue instructions to the subject in Sevastopol. Go into trance. Raise your right arm. Scratch your left elbow. And observers at the other end would record what they saw. And there was exact correlation. The instructions were being carried out. So the Russian scientists and all these other scientists throughout the 1920s and 30s, they tried to explain it. They tried to prove that the mental suggestion was carried by some form of electromagnetic wave. Now we can go back, if you like, to Mesmer, who said that there is something connecting everything in the universe, a magnetic fluid. But that was rejected because it couldn't be proven. And animal magnetism gave way to hypnosis. And the theory behind hypnosis was that it was all to do with the power of suggestion and placebo. But if you've got a distance of 1,700 kilometres, where does suggestion come into it? But scientists were still trying to explain it using a physical framework. They tried to fit it into the physics of the time, and they couldn't. The results proved the opposite. The results demonstrated that mental suggestion is not confined by time and space. The curvature of the Earth didn't prevent it. Radio waves have to bounce. This didn't. They experimented with subjects in lead-lined rooms and steel and iron rooms. Suggestion still got through. But what these experiments did, they were stopped in Russia because in Stalinist Russia it all smacked of supernaturalism, and the funding stopped and it all came to an end. In fact, the book wasn't published. That wasn't published until 1963, and he died just a couple of years after that. But what this led to, this is interesting to me, in the evolution of research into this area, although it was acknowledged as far back as Mesmer and Marquis de Persico, it was accepted happening in life. Didn't need testing, it just happened. But with the development of scientism, Myers was the first one to investigate it scientifically. That inspired the electromagnetic theory of telepathy with Vassiliev. And this inspired J.B. Rhine, setting up the Rhine Institute in America. But the idea of telepathic hypnosis was dropped. Instead, parapsychologists began trying to find an explanation for what they called psi phenomena. Well, to me, this is a nonsense. And I'll go into that in a minute. But that's where it led. Still looking for a mechanistic explanation that fits in with the modern scientific paradigm to explain psi phenomena. And now you've got researchers and students saying, well, what's psi? The research in Russia led to other researchers of a more holistic nature, shall we say. Recognizing the reality of telepathic hypnosis, recognizing the reality of distant healing, spiritual healing, the shaman in Russia and the holistic practitioners began using it. The post-Stalin government got wind of it. We have a book in the library about this, the Russian work in the SPR library in Marlowe's Road. So the Russians quietly carried on with the research, and then the US military intelligence heard about it, initiated their own program at the Stanford Institute with Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ, and we have remote viewing. So we can see there's a historical link between Myers and remote viewing. Now I was at the Society's conference in Edinburgh in 2011. Was it 2011 we went to Edinburgh? I see some of the faces that I recognise from there. And there was a speaker from the United States talking about remote viewing. And I put my hand up at question time and I said to him, is there a relationship between remote viewing and healing? And he said, not really. They lost it completely, but Russell Targ is familiar with that. So there is a link, and we trace it back to Myers. Now we move to Brazil. Since the 1930s, Brazilian medicine, institutionalized medicine, has been incorporating spiritist healing methods since the 1930s. They're years in front of us. Professor Alex Almeida Morieda comes to, and Gino Luchetti, they come to England every 2 years. I've met them several times. And they hold a conference in London called Medicine and Spirituality, where they present their research findings. And they invite UK medical practitioners to listen to their papers and to listen to their research findings. They're 50 years ahead of us. What they practice in Brazil is called remote depossession. What we practice here is called spirit-based therapy. It's the same thing. It's discovering those discarnate entities that are causing ill health and resolving the problem by, if they're the spirits of the earthbound souls, then they're helped to move on to where they should be. If they are non-human dark force entities, then they are dealt with in an appropriate way. And I'm sorry that my book doesn't go into the details of how that's done, but it gives a bibliography of those writers who do go into great details, because my book is all about the work of Myers and how Myers provides the scientific framework to explain all this. Now, I've put together several research proposals, and I've practiced this. So, yes, they're anecdotal accounts, but what I'm suggesting here is that all these research proposals offer the opportunity for controlled clinical trials to be undertaken on the back of what I've discovered so far. You can ask a medium to go into trance and identify what the problem is. Whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual, doesn't matter. Adjunctive treatments for chronic psychological conditions. Domestic violence and sex abuse, as I discovered in America when I went there. By the way, when I was there, on the success of the cases we dealt with, the therapist, the facilitator, went to his employers and said, we'd like to do this officially. And we called our results, and they said, that's a good idea, that's fine. Yeah, we'll do that, providing the whole program can be managed and supervised by an established scientific research institution. So it's a great tribute. That was in 2006. And I'm still looking for that research institution to take that job on. And that's why I'm here today, really. Just to tell you I'm still looking. Paedophilia. There are cases of paedophiles where they say, oh, I really don't want to do this, please help me. But they're treated as incurable. I've personally had 2 cases of Tourette's syndrome. One in an 8-year-old boy, and one in a 26-year-old man. In fact, the clairvoyant diagnosis and the Tourette's syndrome come together in a case that I've posted on the website. The idea is schizophrenia, people who hear voices, especially command hallucinations and addiction. So this is the range of areas where research can be applied. Now, this is actually posted on my website for those of you who are interested in having a look. This is a word-for-word transcription. This experiment assesses the accuracy of a non-medically trained spiritualist medium in her ability to identify a medically diagnosed disease. The case is also illustrative of the discovery of one earthbound attached spirit and one discarnate entity that uses energy for its own survival that's transmitted by a living human. Fascinating case. Absolutely fascinating. Didn't mean any harm. But the man with Tourette's syndrome had a malfunction in his nervous system that was causing the tics. And the medium saw this, she honed in on it, and she saw this as misfiring of the neurons. This created an energy that attracted an entity that used the energy as a source of survival. Amazing. This is the case of the man from India who contacted me. And he was a doctor working in accident and emergency in a hospital in Bombay, and he couldn't work because he was being so adversely affected by the emotions and the pain of his patients. He didn't know how to deal with it. So I asked this friend of mine, medium, who lives quite close to me, never done this kind of work before. He's a Wicca medium and teaches clairvoyance. Never done this kind of thing before. And I asked him to tune in. First of all, what he discovered is quite interesting for me, because what he discovered first of all was a dark spot on each of my knees, which is a residue of the arthritis that caused me to be discharged from the army when I was 22 years old, because they said I'd be a cripple. But I'm not a cripple, but the residue is still there, and he picked up on it. And then I asked him, I didn't give a name, I didn't give a location, I just said I'm holding a person in my mind, and I want you to access this person, tell me what the problem is. And he handed him straight away. You can play the video yourself on the website. So if we want to conduct research into this country, we need to collaborate with the Brazilians. They've trodden a well-worn path. Spiritism Mental Health is an up-to-date collection of chapters on the subject. Well, I think it's in this one, isn't it? Alan, you have an article in this one?
Yes.
A chapter, and so we have two British contributors, Alan Sanderson and Dr. Andrew Powell from the Royal College of Psychiatry. Got chapters in that. And in this one, Exploring Frontiers of the Mind-Brain Relationship, we have chapters from Chris Cook and help me. His name is gone.
I think Andrew Powell's written in that too.
He may have done, yeah. But I'm thinking of the neurologist. End of life experience. Come on. Fennick. David Fennick. My apologies to David. I'm forgetting his name. David Fennick's written it. So we have contributions and understanding and knowledge about the Brazilian work in this country. As I said, they have their conferences here every 2 years. So I find this stimulating and helpful to know that it was one of the founding members of this society that started research in this area 140 years ago. His work has largely been forgotten and lost, but the work of Allan Kardec and the Spiritists have taken it through. We need to join up with them and carry the baton. So my final question is this: which UK institution will take up the challenge? And that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. We are now open for discussion and questions, and Robert, right at the back there, yes.
That was fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. I had a couple of questions. You seem to be conflating two different things, talking about telepathic hypnosis on the one hand and spirit possession on the other, are they in fact two different things? Is one required to deal with the other?
They're very closely connected. They're connected. Can you hear me? Is that okay?
You can use it.
That's good. It's okay. They are connected. What I propose, the conclusions from my research, that telepathic hypnosis is the method by which discarnate spirit communicates with us. If a person who has no knowledge and is vulnerable, on the thick end of the wedge, who suffers some kind of emotional or personality vulnerability, it's very easy to hypnotise them. Now, if they can be hypnotised by another person, and they can be hypnotised at a distance from another person, then it's very easy for a discarnate entity to use the same method.
Yes, I sort of see, but from the point of view of the therapist,
Yeah.
presumably you need to have contact with that individual. So you could actually be with the individual while you're performing the therapy. You don't need to do it at a distance.
It's used at a distance. Remote spirit release therapy is used at a distance in those cases where there is a sizable distance between you. I mean, I've conducted cases in India and in North America where it's impractical for the person to be with you, right? And it's also useful for those cases where there is a conscious resistance on the part of the patient.
Right.
Say they're a criminal, for example, who's been banged up for killing somebody, and they refuse to accept responsibility for the crime, and they're in complete denial. And this is where I see a good opportunity for the method to be applied.
Would you actually have the cooperation and consent of the individual concerned, or is it something you would apply without them necessarily knowing about?
Under normal circumstances, when doing this kind of work, you're doing it on behalf of the client, of the patient who's asked for help, right? But because of the way it works and the way it can work, and it was Irene Hickman who suggested this, was that it can be used for the treatment of criminals without their knowledge, because their will is not their own. They are being controlled by a discarnate entity that has to be uncovered and released. But the ignorance and the denial and the defences of the patient prevent that from happening. So it's a back door.
Yeah, I see. Very good. If I may ask one other question, to what extent would you say that sort of fairly sort of mainstream, conventional psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, hearing voices, that sort of thing, in your opinion, can be explained in terms of spirit possession?
In my opinion, I would go as far as to say the possibility should not be dismissed at all without the investigation, because of the very, very high probability. And I would go as far as to say 100%.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So presumably it's something that you would recommend in an ideal world. You recommend that any psychiatric treatment would investigate.
Well, my response, if I'm approached by a psychiatrist, as I have been from time to time, who's got an insoluble case but he's open-minded, and says, I don't want this patient to be on antipsychotic drugs for the rest of their lives, is there any possibility there's something going on here? Then I will investigate it using the remote methods. And I haven't found a case yet that was not. And I've dealt with several schizophrenics who've been sectioned and put on antipsychotic drugs and always found something attached to them, always.
Yes, absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yes, you're next.
unsteady psychiatrist. I'd like to try and answer this question. I don't work remotely in the way that Dr. Palmer has worked remotely. I work directly with people, and when I was in the NHS some years ago, I just learned about spirit release then. Very difficult to work with schizophrenic patients directly because, well, first of all, one has to use hypnosis, and it's difficult for most schizophrenic patients to trust other people. So it's difficult. Of course, schizophrenia is a very wide-ranging diagnosis, and diagnosis in psychiatry is in a mess. It just concerns symptoms rather than causation. The etiology of most psychiatric conditions isn't known. There's one thing which I would like to say about Terry having put DID, multiple personality disorder, and schizophrenia more or less in the same bed, is that they are very different conditions. DID it seems always to be caused by severe trauma. I suppose in 90% of the cases in severe sexual trauma at a very early age, preschool age. And those cases, though every case of DID is so different, it's very difficult to generalize, but they do show dissociation as the main feature, and the dissociated parts may be functioning at a very high level. I have a patient who's still operating, working in a position of great responsibility, and she travels all over the country, and she has DID of a very severe degree. But the child parts are not in charge, they don't come out when she's at her work. She's in her professional personality, which is entirely effective, although it lacks the ability to feel emotions or to have very difficult for her to have social interaction with people, but she has a job where she manages and talks to large numbers of people, etc. Very effectively. That's really an aside. There are wonderful things, other things I'd like to say. I think we're all very fortunate to be here and hear Terence talk about his book. I've read the book, and it's very well worth reading, and nothing like it is available anywhere. It certainly brought me back to Frederick Myers. Interestingly enough, when I first went into psychiatry, one of my patients said, Frederick Myers was my great uncle. So I had heard of Frederick Myers at that time. What the meaning of that is, I don't know. There is a fascinating connection which I read about many years ago. There's a book called Tompkins and Bird, The Secret Life of Plants. Does anyone know that? Well, I can't recall very much of it, but I remember there was a particular plant, a philodendron, I think it was, which was very sensitive to things going on in its neighborhood. For instance, if something was killed, and you can kill a lot of organisms by pouring boiling water into a pot of yogurt, the philodendron would react with an electrical response. And what was more, and it's just coming back to me now, he was able to produce effects on the philodendron at a great distance, without any suggestion. So I think we need really, if we're looking at this area, to go a step further than Myers and look at plants, because it seems that they are also accessible to telepathy, if you like, at great distances. Well, there's lots more that could be said, and I'm sure other people have comments that they'd like to make. It's a fascinating subject. What a pity that scientists are acting more like religious fanatics. For them, it's the belief, not the method of science that matter. and they believe that life is purely material, therefore they can't look at the things which are so fascinating as, for instance, hypnosis at a distance. And hypnotherapists, I'm afraid, are rather, we all want to be scientists, doctors particularly. It's a really, what should I say? Well, it's a real handicap to be a doctor in this field, because you've been taught in your as a student that everything is material, and so you take that on. Somerset Maugham, in one of his early books, The Magician, writes about a doctor who comes up against magic, and he says, if my eyes show me something which all my teaching assures me is impossible, I have to conclude that my eyes are mistaken.
Hello, yes. What comes to mind at the moment is the transference and counter-transference between a psychotherapist and their patient. And I've read a great deal about unconscious communication taking place in the transference and counter-transference in that relationship. And I wonder if, unbeknown to both the therapist and the patient, some form of telepathy was possibly taking place in that setting.
It's certainly an interesting concept. Concept was brought to our attention by Freud, of course. And yes, of course, there is an interaction between therapist and patient in every case. And the interaction that's going on is largely unconscious. And this is where the value of remote spirit release therapy comes into its own. And again, based on Myers' principle of, actually it wasn't Myers' principle of telepathic hypnosis, but he was the first scientist to research it. But what he wanted to do was to bypass the power of suggestion and belief and expectation, which is a criticism of non-medical interventions in medicine, where placebo is considered to be the measure, the yardstick against which all medicines are measured. And I said to a surgeon at the Royal Society of Medicine one day, if placebo is so powerful, why isn't that just used all the time? And he said, well, because it doesn't cost anything. But the important thing is that science, medical science, does not have an explanation as to how placebo works. And to my way of thinking, a placebo and psi are the same thing. And what I propose is that where science regards any use of the term spirit as a taboo, instead of treating it as a taboo, to recognise that that is what placebo is. It's the power of the spirit over the body, or the mind over the body, right? It's spirit. And my idea, my message really to medical science is forget the taboo, treat spirit as a viable hypothesis and test for it. Don't just discard it and reject it without testing it. But going back to your question about the interaction between therapist and patient, if it's done remotely and there's no connection between the two, and something happens remotely, then that proves that there is a subconscious connection, a telepathic connection, isn't it?
Well, I thought interesting case written by Patrick Casement in his book on learning from the patient, in which he treated a girl who was unable to talk because of a neurotic condition. And so how was he able to provide her with therapy? By just simply going and being with this girl.
Yes.
But he did actually bring her to the position of being able to communicate normally through this situation of just being and being around her and.
What you're describing, I can understand what you're saying. It takes us back to the teachings of the ancient Upanishads, where the master and the student would sit silently for the master to teach the student without words. They would connect subliminally, as Myers would say, or unconsciously, and that's where the communication took place. And this is what remote spirit release therapy does, and what effective psychological and spiritual healing does. I can remember, if I can tell you a little anecdote that goes along with this, whilst I was studying my degree in psychology, I also attended an advanced course in hypnosis at Birkbeck College, London, because I wanted a qualification that would enable me to practice hypnosis in the NHS. And on the first day that I attended this course, I was expelled. I was asked to leave because I demonstrated hypnosis without speaking. Just stood behind a person. What I was doing was mesmerism. Stood behind a person, waved my hand behind their head, they couldn't see me, couldn't hear me, they went into trance. But that was unorthodox, you see. So I never got that qualification.
Well, thank you, but I must give up the mic because there must be other people who want to speak.
Thank you. I must admit to being confused, and it's because I'm not constantly working in this sort of environment, but I'm intrigued by your call for more research. And I accept that. What I don't understand is the nature of the research that you are suggesting needs to be done. Because you need to do some research that is going to convince those people that currently are not willing to be convinced by what is currently available. So there needs to be, and you mentioned the term controlled clinical trials. You need to, I would suggest, explain what it is that controlled clinical trial would be investigating and what it would be comparing whatever it is you are proposing against. And you've mentioned placebo, but it would be very difficult to construct a clinical trial in which psychotic patients, for example, were given placebo. So you would have to compare standard of care in two groups of patients with something extra in the third, and see if you could demonstrate a difference between the two groups. So I'm just intrigued to know, with some precision, what it is you're suggesting ought to be done in the field of research. Okay.
I can answer that question with precision with a research proposal that I'm working on at the moment. It's still in draft form, but it's the essential criteria are quite simple. Take a cohort of people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia and who are hearing voices, particularly command hallucinations, those sorts of voices that demand that they commit destructive acts. So these are people who are influenced in a serious way. That's the cohort that I propose working with. The baseline data is known. They're hearing voices, and this is the nature of the voice that they're hearing, and this is how it's affecting the patient. Right? Then you divide that group of patients into two groups, those that you're going to work with and those that you're not. So you've got your control group. Then you take your spirit release practitioners and you apply the technique to each patient in the experimental group, but not to the control group. And at the end of the trial, you say to the patient in the experimental group, are you still hearing voices? Putting it simply, obviously there are a lot of details that have to be worked through, ethical considerations and so on. But that is the core idea.
So the end point of your study is the disappearance of voices.
Yes. That's being worked on.
I mean, not being a psychiatrist, I'm just curious to know the likelihood and the statistics around being able to prove a difference between those two groups.
So would I. So would I.
A very interesting talk this evening, and I'm a little bit confused over the fact you already quoted a number of cases to us this evening which seem to have achieved their object of helping to alleviate or even cure the symptoms that the people involved were exhibiting. I'm sure you must have presented papers, and perhaps the colleagues in America that you mentioned have also presented papers on the results that you've outlined to us tonight, and I'm just a bit surprised that that isn't something that hasn't already been taken up by people. If they've got an open mind, at the end of the day, you demonstrate results, that should be enough to generate interest in looking further into the matter. I mean, the other thing I think we need to bear in mind is that for centuries, other civilizations and societies, you mentioned the shaman, for example, who came and possessed someone. Well, on the other side of the coin, shamans, medicine men, and women, whatever you care to call them, in various societies, have demonstrated results for people who are exhibiting the sorts of things that we now diagnose in our society as schizophrenia and so on. And the other area that wasn't mentioned, which I think is important, is Jung's collective unconscious. And it does seem to me sometimes that a lot of the things that we discuss, whether it's, for example, telepathy, plants, the possession that you mentioned, whether or not this is a sort of a feature that we need to perhaps look into a bit more.
Which question would you like me to answer first?
Sorry. Well, I suppose there was one of why haven't the results and the papers that you may have presented by you and other colleagues who are involved in the field.
Let's deal with that one, shall we? At the end of my book, there was an appendix of all the published works that are known to me. I did omit one because it came out too late to have inserted as it went to press. There's a bibliography appendix of those authors who have published their case histories in great depth. Irene Hickman, William Baldwin, Edith Fiore, Shakuntala Modi. There's a whole list of practitioners with experience that's far greater than mine, going back to Carl Wickland, going back to the 1920s. So there is nothing to be gained from me publishing my case histories. What I would like to see is the controlled clinical trials that supports those case histories. The second question I'd like to answer about Jung, and Jung is mentioned in my book because his idea of the collective unconscious was in fact inspired by Myers, and that is acknowledged academically that when Jung was writing his own doctoral thesis, he referenced the work of Myers. So, and Myers' idea of the greater subliminal mind gave Jung his idea of the collective unconscious. And there was another question you asked.
Well, the other aspect was the fact that other civilizations through centuries of time have had their shamans and people who have certain gifts, whether they're spiritual or whatever. And as we had our psychic healers in this country, for example.
I have acknowledged that in the book. And as you can see, it's 400 pages.
Yeah. No, I wasn't so much criticising whether or not you refer to it. It just seems to me that these other events or incidents, or whatever you care to call them, bear out much of what you've been saying this evening.
Well, yes, they do. They're very, very relevant. And anthropology and the study of traditional religions around the world and throughout history has an awful lot to teach us, as Myers himself acknowledged. So yes, but as I said at the beginning of my talk, there are only two aspects of Myers' work that I've got time to talk about. One is the continuum, the other is the telepathic hypnosis. But yes, you're absolutely right. Worldwide shamanism has a part to play.
I'm just thinking about your meeting with the bishop. I'm wondering in what respects, if any, does spirit release therapy compare it at all with conventional exorcism?
Yes, I approached this in chapter 3 where I take cases of exorcism. Two cases were conducted by the American psychiatrist M. Scott Peck. Have we heard of M. Scott Peck? He wrote The Road Less Travelled. He also wrote People of the Lie and Glimpses of the Devil, where he explains in great detail these two cases of Becker and Jersey. And I use those two cases to illustrate where he decided that exorcism was the right course of action to take. I disagree with him because one of the cases, I think it was Jersey, who was the one that he diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and he was, after a 4-hour session of interviewing her and arriving at that clinical diagnosis, as he was about to get up and leave, she said, "But wouldn't you like to talk to my spirits?" So, and that took him completely by surprise. He wasn't expecting that at all. So he did begin to engage with them. He spoke to 2 of them, but he didn't have the knowledge. He went on with the exorcism, and it was reported 6 years after that case that she still had voices talking to her, that those spirits were still with her, and they were spirits of earthbounds. So when I discussed this with Bishop Ambrose Griffiths, he said, "You're absolutely right, this should become common knowledge," because cases that demand genuine rituale Romanum exorcism are extremely rare. But far more common are those cases that you speak about.
Could I also ask about the vulnerability model? Does it allow for someone who is non-hypnotizable, a skeptic, and they could possibly have spiritual experiences as well?
Well, yes, this is a question that John asked me. He asked me a short while ago, what percentage of the population do I believe are influenced by spirit? And my answer is this. Okay, this is my understanding. As human beings, we are, and this is what Myers drew as a conclusion, and I certainly agree with him, as human beings, we are a spirit that possesses a human body. Okay? So, to what degree are we influenced by spirit? 100%. If we have a weak ego, or a fragile sense of self, or a vulnerability in any way, according to my model, right, then you're more inclined to notice it. So people can go through their lives without noticing it at all. Take, for example, the scientist, the mathematician, the person whose career is controlled by rational logic only, and they have no belief in such things. Then we can ask the question which Myers asked, where does the creative inspiration come from? Where do their ideas come from? Are they manufactured in this neurological network we call the brain? What is creative inspiration? What is genius? And he researched it, wrote about it extensively. So in answer to your question, yeah, 100%. It's just that people with strictly rational minds don't recognise it.
Unless it happens.
Unless it happens. Unless it hits them in the face. Which is what happened to me. Hit me in the face.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
We're running short of time. I think we have time for only 2 more questions. There's a question there, and then one in And there's someone desperate up at the back, so it's okay, 3 questions.
I enjoyed your talk very much, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a confession to make, and that is that in the dim and distant past I took a degree in physics. So my question is going to be rather on those lines. You talked about telepathy, and I'd like to know how far we are along the line of getting to suggest a mechanism for telepathy. You mentioned the distances of which it can take place. It put me in mind of an article I read in the literature on poltergeists, and on that occasion there happened to be, probably people will be able to remember this because they'll have read the same case history as I did, where the subject of the poltergeist was in a sort of china shop, so that you had rows and rows and rows of china, and of course he was walking around, and of course you get the poltergeist phenomenon somewhere, and they'd be able to plot it out in 3 dimensions, you see, and find out if there was any inverse square law that it was working upon. Well, if my memory serves me right, the answer was that they weren't able to find an inverse square law. When you mentioned telepathic communication between England and Australia and so on, I wondered, well, what's going on? What mechanisms are there that a scientist would recognise as going on there? Bearing in mind that since Myers we've had the advent of quantum mechanics, and we've had what Einstein described as spooky action at a distance, and we've got quantum entanglement as well. So I throw that to you.
Again, which one would you like me to answer first? It's a very, very broad subject, and I have addressed it, and I've addressed it in terms of going back to Mesmer's animal magnetism, the theory that there is a connection with everything in the universe, a connection that science is still yet unable to identify. There is certainly an interaction there. Myers, in the 19th century, when he observed these phenomena, said quite simply that physics, the science of physics, is still incomplete. There is more to learn, and we need to be open to investigating what